Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. Let's unbox the AYANEO next. Okay, kind of excited because I have actually no idea what's going on here. I don't know what to expect. Are they giving me gloves? Alright, here we go. Alright, so as instructed, I've put on the gloves to open the next box. It's kind of a, let's have a relaxing beginning to this, right? I have to admit, there is some anticipation. Like, I still don't know. Oh, what is this? Is it like plexiglass? It's like some heavy-duty acrylic? Goodness gracious, it's heavy. These gloves are all slippery. All right, so here it is. I haven't. It's actually kind of difficult to use these gloves to take off this smooth glass-like cover. This is one nice case. Goodness gracious. It's like dark acrylic. Explore the future. Oh, that's pretty cool. Look at that. That's awesome. That is an exceptionally nice unboxing experience. Oh, look how awesome that is. That is so cool. That is really awesome. Is this where the fingerprint sensor is? Oh, so cool. Oh, okay. So this is all just a template of where everything goes. I already have all this stuff, so I don't need extra of it, so this is fine. Alrighty, so I'm still going to be wearing the gloves for a little bit. But when I start using the device proper, I'm going to actually take those off. But let's go ahead and just take a look at what this has to offer. It is exceptionally refined compared to the actual Neo itself. There's a small amount of grip right here. It's like ergonomics wise, it's actually very nice. These, oh yeah, look at those triggers. The triggers themselves are an amazing improvement, like considerably large improvement over That's really nice. Here we have the power button, which I think is also the fingerprint sensor. That's really cool. Nice recess right here for the 3.5mm audio jack, and then also the USB-C charging port. We have a USB-C charging port on the bottom, which can also be used for the included dock. On the back, I have number 5 here. This is tagged with my name, Phawx. This is awesome. Thank you so much to the AYA group for sending this out my way and putting it on there for me. That's super cool. That's, oh man, the D-pad. Okay. All right, so it's membrane based. So the D-pad, it's possible to push down in the center of the D-pad. Yeah, you can hit all 4. We'll see how, if that registers, internally, but it's got a nice contour through the entire thing. Let me actually, use my actual thumb on it without having these gloves over it. And then what are these? What are these 2 buttons? Oh, look at these analogs. Oh my goodness. These are so much of an improvement. Oh, look at these. Nice concave instead of convex, you know what I mean? Like, or even just flat, but it lets you, it has a recess in it so that your finger can sit into it. And there's this ribbed exterior for grip. All right, now we're gonna peel this off. Now, the most important thing that I think a lot of people are interested in is the SoC on this device. All right, segueing into the SoC, this is obviously using the 5800U. There are different configurations with regard to RAM, SSD, and all that other stuff, but largely let's just talk about the 5800U portion of this. I will be talking about the general fit and finish of the buttons and how that all factors into what are improvements on the AYANEO next, but however, let's take a look at the different chipsets across all the different AYANEOs. Now I have benchmarked all these different systems. This is the original 4500U retail version. This is the 4800U retro power version, and then this is the 5800U AYANEO Next. All of these are socket FP6. They all feature the same Vega iGPU. However, there's only 6 CUs of there. We have 8 CU here. They're clocked differently, but largely that doesn't matter because after we start approaching a higher frequency on Vega, there's massive diminishing returns. The bigger picture here is that it's using Zen 3 CPUs on here, which have a number of improvements, along with per core voltage enhancements on with Cezanne versus the older Renoir platform. That does have improvements. Now, across all 3 of these platforms, I have done 5 different benchmarks. Now, just to get it clear so that you understand that they're all on the same base. Now, they are all on the latest version of Windows 10 21H1. They all are on the 21.12.1 Radeon drivers in power config. They are defaulted at high performance mode just because that's what my retro power came at. The only thing is on retro power 1 in the link state power management, it was set to off because that's what high profile power does. I don't really recommend that. I really do recommend maximum power savings. Now that might seem counterintuitive. Maximum power savings really only helps if you're on super high TDPs. Helps. It doesn't do anything. Maximum power savings will have the same effect, but actually you'll get better results at lower TDPs. So I really do recommend having that on. And then in the AMD power slider as well as the graphics power settings, I have that set to maximum performance. And that's across all of them. All right, now that I've explained my methodology so that you can recreate these benches yourself, let's go ahead and get into the benches themselves. Now, the only thing that I need to talk about here is specifically the identifiers on the bottom. Now, what does default mean? Default was supposed to mean what is the machine runs at by default. However, PL2 and PL1, PL2 is 18 watt, PL1 is 17 watt, typically on the 4500U and the 4800U. I manually changed that so that PL1 and PL2 is 18 watt. On the 5800U, the TDP is actually much higher. I manually set that PL1, PL2 to be 18 watt. So default basically just means 18 watt TDP, 0 GPU clock manipulation. Now on the next one, you can see 12 watt, 1000. It says 1100 here. All of them are actually 1000, 1 gigahertz. So that means 12 watt TDP, and I statically set the GPU to 1 gigahertz each. Now on the 5 watt version, now, in this particular thing, you should actually pay attention. You can see that the 5800U is actually getting a lower score, and I'm going to explain that in 1 second. So you can see 5 watt and then 400, 400. That means that the TDP is set to 5 watt, PL1, PL2, and the GPU is statically clocked at 400 megahertz. Now, the thing about the 5800U is that Ryzen Adjust, the program that adjusts the TDP and statically sets the GPU clock, doesn't actually work on statically setting the GPU clock on the Vega GPU on the 5800U. So every one of these tests is the only caveat here is that the GPU will be self-modifying on all of the 5800U tests based on their own power table. And as a result, you can see here on the 5 watt that we actually get a worse score because the power table on 5 watt really is inefficiently set on these devices. The 5800U, when they set these power tables, the device is not really supposed to be meant to run at this low TDP. So when you manually adjust the GPU, you can actually extract far better performance by forcing the CPU into a lower state and pushing the GPU up higher. So that's the only real caveat here, but let's go ahead and jump into these benchmarks. So if we take a look at default, which is 18 watt, right? We can see on 4500U to the 4800U, the 4800U has a basic 10% bump over the 4500U at the same TDP, 18 watt, no GPU clock adjustment. The interesting thing here in Heaven is an interesting benchmark because it really becomes CPU bound very fast. This is really going to be becoming helpful where you're kind of middling around 50 FPS and you need to hit 60 FPS. This is where the 5800U really is going to start to shine. Now, if we take a look at the 12 watt, 1 gigahertz GPU static clock, again, that's only for 4500U and 4800U, not the 5800U. We can clearly see that there is, once again, that kind of, it's like a 13%, 14% performance improvement on the 4800U. And then we have not a giant increase, maybe like 6 or 7% on 4800U to 5800U. The important thing to take away here is that at 12 watt, not statically, not doing anything with the GPU, we're actually matching 18 watt TDP on the 4800U, but running at 12 watt on the 5800U. That's actually pretty great. It's a pretty large reduction in power, 30%, 40%
power reduction and still achieving around the same score, around the same performance as the 4800U. So that's one area that is pretty compelling. Now, obviously not huge performance improvements, but it is better. Now, if we take a look at the 5 watt, because we can't manipulate the GPU, the 5800U actually really suffers at lower TDP, and going below 12 watt really isn't recommended at the current time until we can start leveraging GPU modification. All right, next up is the Resident Evil 6 benchmark. Now, this is, once again, if we take a look at the default TDP, the default benchmarks, we can clearly see that there's a 20% lead over the 4800U to the 5800U, which is pretty gigantic, and it's largely all thanks just to that CPU improvements. If we take a look at the 500U and the 4800U, it's like basically 5%, nothing to write home about, almost negligible. You wouldn't bother upgrading for that reason. Now, if we take a look at the 12 watt scores, once again, it's kind of similar, kind of the same thing. It's like 5% increase between the 4500U and the 4800U. However, it's still that almost 20% increase from the 4800U to the 5800U. And once again, if we take a look at the 12 watt score on the 5800U versus the 18 watt TDP on the 4800U, we can see once again that 5800U at 12 watt is almost outperforming the 4800U, and largely this is really just the CPU benefits. The Vega GPU is just a giant hog and has massively diminishing returns. So we're seeing a lot of this benefit come from the CPU improvements. Now, again, if we take a look at the 5 watt score, this is 400 megahertz that I'm set on both the 4500U and the 4800U. I can't set it on the 5800U. We can clearly see that because that power is so low and we can't force the system into a better state, that the 5800U really lags behind here. Now, it should be noted that the 12 watt scores, these 1 gigahertz GPU clocks, are better scores like this. If I did not touch the GPU, I'd have worse scores for both of them, and the 5800U would just be blowing past them even more. So these scores that you're seeing at the 12 watt are optimized scores on the 4500U and the 4800U, and then you can see that they're optimized scores on the 5 watt as well, but because we can't do anything, 5800U just really lags behind. For the Gears 5 benchmark, the only thing that I did was change it to a very low preset in the graphical settings. By default, it's low on these particular devices, so it can go a 1 notch lower, and I set it to that. So that is what you were looking at here, the very low preset. Now on the 4500U, we're seeing 52.7 FPS average on the benchmark, and then on the 4800U, we're seeing 61.8. And on the 5800U, we're seeing 64.8. And this is using the default TDP, which is what I label as 18 watt for PL1 and PL2, no GPU modification. If we take a look at the 12 watt, 1 gigahertz, you can see that the 4500U takes a pretty big hit. However, the 4800U really still stays toe-to-toe, and we don't see that ginormous performance improvement that we saw before from the 1500U to the 4800U. It's similar in performance, but the 4800U is still similar in performance to the 18 watt score as well. We're really GPU bound here, and as I've said, 1 gigahertz on the Vega GPU is really where the sweet spot for the Vega GPU. After we start ramping up in frequency, the diminishing returns rapidly starts decreasing. So this is really just that sweet spot, and it's really evident when you take a look at this 12 watt 1 gigahertz score versus the 5800U, when it's the only improvements really being the CPU alone. And then when we take a look at the 5 watt score, we can see that the 4800U obviously pulls ahead because I can statically set the GPU. If I was able to do it on the 1500U, I have no doubt that it would improve. All right, the next benchmark, Street Fighter V. This is the benchmark direct from Capcom. Now, at default TDP, the 4500U doesn't quite hit 60 FPS, whereas the 4800U and the 5800U do. Now, the more compelling thing is the 12 watt. Now, once again, remember when I was saying on the Heaven benchmark, at 12 watt, we were getting basically the same performance as 18 watt TDP on the 4800U. Once again, that is kind of showing that it's still true on the 5800U. So at 12 watt, not messing with the GPU clock at all, just doing 12 watt TDP, nearly hitting 60 FPS the entire time. It's slightly under, but I mean, it's kind of like splitting hairs at that point. So it's actually really impressive to see. And then 5 watt scores, you can see, once again, 5800U scores just absolutely tanking because we can't modify the GPU clock at all. Last, we're going to be taking a look at the Forza 5 Horizon benchmark. This is the benchmark included in the game itself. Once again, we're going to be using the very low graphical preset, the lowest that it can go when we're doing this benchmark. On the 4500U, we get 43 FPS average. On the 4800U, we get a 48 FPS average. And then on the 5800U, we get a 57 FPS average. So once again, we're seeing that basic 20% performance improvement from 4800U to the 5800U in this particular instance. Then when we take a look at the 12-watt score, we can clearly see once again that the 5800U is basically doing the same thing that the 4800U is doing at 18 watt, where the 5800U does at 12 watt. So that it's a gigantic performance reduction, and we're getting nearly the same performance as the 4800U. So that is worthwhile insofar as that if you were to think about it from a total system power, 12 watt TDP would equal around nearly 19 watt to 20 watt total system power. That's about 2.5 hours of battery life, versus on the 4800U, when we're running at 18 watt TDP, which is running 25 watt, 26 watt total system power, we're under 2 hours there. So we basically get 45 minutes of extra battery life on the 5800U and having the same performance in that respect, if you can kind of get a better understanding of what's going on there. And then once again, if we take a look at the 5-watt score, the 5800U just lags behind because I'm able to optimize the 4500U and the 4800U. So that's pretty much it for the benchmarks, so you can get a better idea of what's going on between these different devices. You know, it's not gigantic improvements, you know, just 20%, 10%. They're not anything really to write home about, but it is better. All right, now let's talk a little bit about build quality. So there are some considerable differences between the older AYANEO versus the AYANEO Next. And largely, I think bigger picture stuff that you're going to see here is the triggers themselves. So now this is where the Hall sensor comes in. So the Hall sensor, there's a magnet right here, right? There's a magnet right there. And then you have the Hall sensor right there. And what the Hall sensor does is, as the magnet gets closer and closer to the magnet, it detects that intensity, and the difference in intensity determines the analog switch itself. So this is how the analog stick works. So you can see right here that it's all single stage. There is no dual stage here. There's just a really super wide, like, I mean, there's just a lot of travel on this, versus what the old AYANEO analog stick did. Now, because it had to work in the confines of the space that it was before, it actually had to work as a pressure switch. So if we actually like go ahead and load up, all right, so now we can see right here. Now if I just press down on here, you can see that we're getting an analog signal, but that's all just based on pressure, and there's not a bunch of travel in there. So while it does work, and it did work while finessing on the trigger itself, it didn't offer a great deal of travel, versus when we take a look at the Neo Next. You know, at this point I should show you the fingerprint sensor as well. Alright, so there's a start screen, and what you do is you just slide, and there you go. Alright, so now if we go ahead and take a look at the trigger here, I have a different menu up. You can see like how much absolute travel I have on this trigger. So this is also just how the shape of it is, and I'll talk about it in terms of how it feels in terms of build quality and stuff. When you're holding it, it does scoop your finger. So you can see that there's this scoop right here that it's very comfortable. It's really comfortable. It's a really nice, these are excellent triggers. They did a great job on the triggers. I'm very happy with the triggers overall. But that's just kind of one of the things that they did to improve it. Let me go ahead and power this down again. If we take a look at the differences, largely everything kind of looks the same. You can see that the AYANEO is just a little bit larger. We can see the dual stereo speakers right here. We can see the Wi-Fi antenna here and here. So the two Wi-Fi antennas are there. I don't know where the Wi-Fi antennas are. Let me power this down. I don't know where the Wi-Fi antennas are located here. We can clearly see them over here. So this is Wi-Fi 6E, and they separated them and put them on these rumble motors that you can see right here, which are considerably beefier than earlier ones. Then we have the newer analog sticks here. Now the analog sticks themselves, these have a much larger range in terms of how much motion you can put them on. They sit taller. Overall, I really like the feel of the analog sticks. I think they still need improvements in the firmware for them in terms of their range. But overall, I am a big fan of these. I think with the firmware improvement, again, this is an early prototype that I have, but I really like these, and I think they're just a firmware update away from being super awesome. But this is what the inside looks like. Under here, we have the heatsink fan. This is the business end, was the 5800U. Overall, you can see that the design is quite similar, and there's just really, it's just quality of life improvements overall that you can clearly see are the hallmarks of what the AYANEO Next are. Alright, now let's start talking about inputs and other stuff while we talk about general build quality. Now, these are all largely different than the original AYANEO. Now, this one, you can literally hear the membranes on it. Like, they have snap. Like, these are like super really snappy membranes. Now, I am a stickler for D-pads. This one has a very high pivot point. I do like the curvature of the D-pad. I think, like, design-wise, if this was all on paper, it would all sound good. Right now, I need to put a little bit more time into this D-pad. I'm not gelling with this D-pad just yet. General movement, there is zero guesswork that I'm pushing on anything. You don't need to push hard. It's really well understood with how responsive those membranes are. However, because it has a high pivot, like, it's easy to hit all. Now, I'm not saying you're going to do this. This is not how you're going to be playing. Now, when you're going to be playing, you're going to be doing... It's super easy to know that you're going to be doing any one of those 4 cardinal directions. The 4-way, I am not concerned with this at all. 8-way is where I am concerned with this D-pad. I need to put a little bit more time in this. That'll be for my like full review of this device. But right now, I'm not gelling with the D-pad 100%. I think on paper, it all sounds great. Like, it's designed really well. The membranes are snappy, but there's just something in here. I think the high pivot point is something that maybe by design it really needs to be, but I have to use it more. Let me play some fighting games on this, and I'll have a better opinion on this. But right now, it's not gelling with me. These analog sticks. So these analog sticks are super dope. They're really good. I mean, just how much travel they have, how much tension is required to push in any given direction are excellent. I love the concave surface. I love the material. I love the ribbed exterior. I wouldn't change this, even though you have the ability to change this. Now, the one thing that I do want updated, and this is just can be updated in firmware, is if you see that when I'm pushing all the way, that I'm not actually going all the way in software. Likewise, if I go up, down, left, right, it goes all the way, but along the diagonals, it kind of inches back a little bit, and this is a problem. You see, like right there, like this will be a problem in some 3D games where, you know, dead zone issues or whatever extension that they have, your character might only like jog or walk and not run. We don't really have that present on the right analog stick. It's just like on the bottom left right over here. But everywhere else is mostly good. And then if we just talk about like cardinal snapping, it does have, you know, generalness about, I want to say like a general Xbox 360 generic pad that we've seen from these will have, that they'll want to hover and snap to the cardinal directions. However, the dead zone is really small, which is really nice. It'll start pushing. Overall, it's really just the design of the analog sticks that are just really excellent. A joy to actually use. Honestly, I think all they really need is just a firmware update, just so that all the values they max out when you push into a max direction. And that's all I really require. I can understand some people wanting it to be less magnetism along the cardinals. That doesn't bother me as much. I know that some people do get bothered by that. So that's something that, you know, if that's a problem for you, you should definitely voice your opinion. 100% this needs to go all the way. Like, I'm pushing as much as I can and it's not reaching. This is a problem for 3D games, especially for running in a specific direction where your character might not run because it's just not getting that value. So that's one thing. Now, these buttons, they are the same type of snappy membrane. These are really, really nice. I have zero bad things to say about these face buttons. They're really nice, excellent. These triggers are excellent. These triggers actually remind me a lot of the GPD Win 3's triggers. These triggers are just they're excellent. I even just the left bumper and right bumper, much like how I said, like how the GPD Win 3 bumpers were excellent. Now, obviously, these are way larger than on the GPD Win 3, but they kind of evoke the same feeling I had, except these have way more travel. Like you can really finesse all you want on these. These have a sensational amount of travel. So these triggers are a huge upgrade over the original AYANEO. If that was something that bothered you, but you still like the general overall feel of the AYANEO in terms of a slate gamepad and wanted something like this, so then I could see that being one of the reasons that you wanted to upgrade. This is just really nice. Now, the other thing that we need to talk about is obviously the contoured back part of this, where it is the ergonomics of it. I like this over the original AYANEO a lot. I find that having these pads here, especially how it is cupped right in here, even just using the D-pad and having my forefinger and index finger just kind of sitting down below, not all up here, I found this to be really comfortable as well. Overall, it's easier to hold for me than the AYANEO Prime, the older AYANEO. So I think all of the improvements that they have went for are felt. I think that I prefer the old AYANEO having specific keyboard buttons, specific escape buttons, specific alt tab. Like in this one, if you just press this, it'll just do like a desktop mode, and if you hold it, it brings up the task manager. So there are different things. And then if this button is just like Control Shift F12, it's a whole bunch of crazy. So it's Control. Let me go look it up. Yeah, so it's Control Win F12. Left control, right control, left win, and F12 is what this button does. So it's pretty nuts. If you hold this and then press the next button over, it does and it does another virtual screen over. Overall, I still think I prefer the old AYANEO cluster instrument cluster that they had here, and obviously the other button that they got rid of was the RGB one from the old Founders Edition. That wasn't really necessary on the newer AYANEOs either. But I still like the Xbox button, the home button. I wish that wasn't gone either. But basically, I do prefer the older AYANEO buttons down here as opposed to these newer buttons. So that's one thing that I wished translated over to the newer build. So that's pretty much it. We're going to be taking a look at just game demos right now. Every one of these game demos, you'll be able to see they're all running at 18 watt, which is what I consider default. So every game demo you're going to be seeing is PL1, PL2 set to 18 watt TDP, and you'll be able to see the performance metrics on those, everything except Yuzu, which you can clearly see it's running at 60 FPS, which is really impressive to see. I'll be doing emulation videos separately just from this, just so that it's easier to kind of find. But after those game demos, I'll talk about the conclusion of this, which will wrap up the video.
old man. The entire world is infected with them.
Keep pushing through. Try to get out of this swamp.
It's dropping leeches!
Legions in the water. We must be the first wave of troops are sending in.
2 soldiers and a driver isn't exactly what I'd call a wave.
You're a driver.
Delivery driver. Award winner.
It's done. Get out of the way.
Welcome back, Phawx. In 400 yards, turn left. Turn left. Turn around when it is safe to do so. In 400 yards, turn left. Turn left.
Alright, that's pretty much it. This is the conclusion of my quick impressions of the AYANEO Next. There are a host of improvements just fundamentally form factor wise on the AYANEO Next. I'm not a big fan of the D-pad. I do need a little bit more time with it. I'm not gelling with it right now. I have to be honest, I'm not gelling with it. Now, the analog sticks, they are much better. I do think that they need a firmware update to make them perfect, but I love these analog sticks. They are replaceable. I would never replace them. They are excellent. These face buttons are great. These triggers are fantastic. These instrument cluster, I wish were like the older ones. They're serviceable, but I still would prefer the older ones. This fingerprint reader is not the best. It's fine. It works fine, but like I really wish that this was the fingerprint reader here and you can just use your thumb like it is on like the Win 3 or just other types of Windows devices where it's very simple. It's easy to not get the fingerprint reader to work, like swiping your finger across doesn't always work. I've had like 70% hit rate. So I'm almost at the point where I'm just going to go back to using a pin code on the device. I'm not if it doesn't work 100% of the time, I'm not going to bother. So having said that about ergonomics, form factor, it is clearly an improvement. If we just talk about the SoC, the 5800U is clearly better than the 4500U and clearly better than the 4800U. One thing that I think people are getting kind of tied up with is that the 5800U really isn't gigantically better in performance over the 4800U. I mean, in some benchmarks we're showing like 20%, but 20% isn't a number that people are really going to write home about. Instead, I would rather say have the 5800U, run it at 12 watt. 12 watt is what I run my 4800U at. And if I could get 18 watt performance at 12 watt like I can on the 5800U, I would do that. I mean, I do it now, but I can get a clear performance improvement, like 20% performance improvement, but at the same wattage, right, as the 4800U. If you can get a 30% power reduction, but the same performance as the 4800U, that's compelling. Like, you know, you're still going to be playing games. You're going to be going to low preset settings, but you'll still be able to hit 60 FPS in a lot of games. And you'll be able to get 2.5 hours of battery life on these really demanding games at low settings. And that's not speaking of indie games. Indie games, you're going to get like 4 or 5 hours depending on what it's going to take and what type of game it is. But that's generally where this is, right? So I still find it compelling if you've never had a device like this. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is that the Steam Deck is coming. And the Steam Deck performance is going to be impressive. However, if you have not reserved a Steam Deck today, you know, the reservation numbers, they're going out to like 2023. So I realize that this device is not coming out till March of this year. But if you haven't reserved a Steam Deck and you're on the fence about it, and you can get the AYANEO first, I can understand the reason why you would want to get this, especially when, you know, we take a look at, you know, resale value, because it's going to be insane. We know that Steam Deck, when people are selling on eBay, they're going to go much more than the retail price. It's going to happen. So this kind of sits in this weird valley, and I understand that when people are taking a look at RDNA 2 based handhelds like the Steam Deck, they're saying, well, what's the point of this? I still think that this has value, either time or ergonomics. Like, I can understand either one of these. Like, this is still going to be a little bit smaller than a Steam Deck. Steam Deck's probably going to be out to about here. So this device is still going to be smaller, still has really good ergonomics, has really good triggers, but I can understand how someone could convince themselves to get something like this. That's basically my spiel. I get where everyone's coming from. I wish that it was Rembrandt as well. I still think that this is worthwhile. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.